Hi class, today's lesson is lesson 8-6. It's on quadrilaterals. Today's purpose is to identify, classify, and compare quadrilaterals. But before we identify, classify, and compare quadrilaterals, we need to know what quadrilaterals are. Definition of a quadrilateral is a plane figure with 4 sides and 4 angles. Quad meaning 4. One type of quadrilateral is a parallelogram. A parallelogram has opposite sides that are parallel and congruent, and its opposite angles are also congruent. In other words, you see that the length of this side is equivalent to the length of this side. You see the length of this side of the parallelogram is equivalent to the length of this side of the parallelogram. Also, the opposite angles, this angle is equivalent to that angle, and this angle is equivalent to the angle opposite as well. Next, we have a quadrilateral that is very familiar to you. It's a rectangle. It's a parallelogram with 4 right angles, and opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So there we have the 4 right angles. Opposite sides are equivalent to each other in length. A rhombus. A rhombus is a 4-sided figure as well. It's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. In other words, all 4 of these sides are the same measure. And opposite angles are congruent. This angle equivalent to this angle equivalent to this angle. Next, we have a square, another very common shape that you've seen. It's a rectangle with 4 congruent sides. The length of each of these sides the same, and all the angles are 90 degrees or right angles. Finally, we come to the last quadrilateral, and that's the trapezoid. This is a quadrilateral with exactly 2 parallel sides. 2 parallel sides, and it says it may have 2 right angles as well, but the important thing is 2 parallel sides. This side is parallel to this side. Different lengths, but they are parallel. This side exactly parallel to this side. The other 2 remaining sides opposite each other are not parallel. This is a drawing that I want you to draw. It kind of illustrates the relationship of all quadrilaterals. All quadrilaterals include all these different defined terms that we used, including this one, which lies outside. It's an irregular quadrilateral. But let's look at what it includes. It includes parallelograms. And parallelograms also includes rectangles, and parallelograms are squares, and parallelograms are rhombuses. As we look at squares in particular, squares can be classified as rhombuses. Squares can also be classified as rectangles. That's how they're related. Over on the other circle, separate from parallelograms, are trapezoids. And this is in a separate circle because only 2 of the sides are parallel. The other 2 remaining opposite sides are not. Naming quadrilaterals. Let's go ahead and name a few here. This one, 4 congruent sides, and the opposite angles are equivalent. This makes this a rhombus. Next. Here we have exactly 2 parallel sides. Although we could call this a parallelogram and this a parallelogram as well, more specifically, this is a trapezoid. Exactly 2 parallel sides. Here we have certainly a parallelogram. We could call it a rectangle. We could even call it a rhombus, but more specifically, it's a square. because it's a type of rhombus that has 90 degrees. Finally, we look at this, and this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides. This is not a quadrilateral. In fact, what kind of shape is it? It's got 5 sides. It's actually a pentagon. 5, penta meaning 5. Here we see the same drawing that you have in your notes, and now we're going to solve these classification problems using that drawing. It says a rhombus that is a rectangle is also a what? So we look at rhombuses. A rhombus that is also a rectangle, well, it overlaps with rectangles right here, and a rhombus that's a rectangle is called a square. Next. A square can also be called a blank, blank, and a blank. Now let's take a look at this. Here we have the square. It can be called a rhombus, meaning it has 4 congruent sides. It can be called a rectangle. Why? Because it has 4 opposite sides are parallel and they're 90 degrees. That's what rectangles are. And finally, it can also be considered a parallelogram. And why a parallelogram? Well, because the sides of a square are parallel to the opposite sides. Finally, this is your charge to complete this problem. It says, tell whether all squares are rhombuses and whether all rhombuses are squares. And finally, number 2 is compare a trapezoid with a rectangle. All right, we'll see you in class.